brought to you by, there we go, the good old recording in progress. Brought to you by the New York Equitable Economies Coalition, which is a growing coalition of nonprofits that are trying to reimagine and do work in the supply chain and procurement space through a racial and economic justice lens. And so that's what's really, we hope has brought you all here to try and figure out together, to be in community with each other and try to figure out sort of how can we sort of uplift and explore more equitable ways to sort of open the opportunity set for BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants. My name is George Suttles. In my day job, I'm the executive director of the Common Fund Institute, which is the education and research arm of Common Fund, which is an asset management firm in the endowment space. So we work with nonprofits as institutional investors. I also sit on several boards. Full disclosure, I sit on the board of the New York Foundation and the Laundromat Project, but I promise you that neither Ricky or Aisha are here under duress. This is just something that I know they care about, and so sort of here we are. And then, of course, Diana Noriega, in her role at Good Shepherd Services, has been a co-conspirator and partner in trying to organize folks around this effort. So with that being said, again, gratitude to each and every one of you. Before we're going to have a conversation with myself, Ricky, Diana, and Aisha. And then really, this is meant to be a roundtable, not like a webinar where we're, sort of providing you a bunch of information. You ask a couple of questions and then you log off. The fact of the matter is, again, to be totally transparent, we have some ideas, some speculation, some frameworks, some approaches, but really we don't have any concrete answers for you. The hope is that, like any good coalition, we can sort of co-create frameworks and co-create, solutions and co-create, more generative questions that will get us all to where we want to be. So we've got some things to share, but for the most part, I would encourage each and every person on this call to, leverage the chat, unmute yourself, ask questions, share resources, and things of that nature. So, this is a Zoom space, but it's more of a sort of community of learning and practice and not a webinar. So we want folks to be active in their inquiries and active in their information sharing, because we're all just trying to figure this out together. So thank you all, Ricky, Aisha, Diana, thank you so much. Before we jump in, I'd love for each and every one of you to introduce yourselves. Ricky, Aisha, why don't we start with you, then have you go, Ricky, and then Diana, you can, last but certainly not least, you can introduce yourself, tell us about your role, your organization, and sort of why you think this topic is important to you and your organization. So Aisha, let's start with you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you. And thank you for your patience with me. Technology, yes, usually it's good, but today, of course. My name is Aisha Williams. I am currently Deputy Director at an arts and social justice organization called the Laundromat Project, and I will be incoming Executive Director in January of 2023. I'm adding that to my introductions to get used to that newness. But why is this topic important to me? It's particularly important to me because we, as the Laundromat Project, are an organization that is Black rooted and POC centered, and our work is based around a particular set of POC centered principles. And so with that, in a way to both hold ourselves accountable in living a particular value, understanding the need to make space for more vendors of color, bringing them into the rooms and into spaces where they are often overlooked for reasons that are not of their own doing. Just the way that the system is structured leaves fewer pathways to moving into securing and procuring particular jobs and contracts and things of that nature. So as an organization, both feeling a responsibility of living in that value, but also creating opportunities to share how other organizations can follow along those same lines. So whatever tools, whatever that we might use and consider, and lessons that have been learned, definitely wanting to share that out with other folks so that we can bring more awareness and attention to bringing more POC folks into the space.
Awesome, thanks, Aisha. Ricky, I would invite you to sort of share, give us an intro, share your thoughts.
Thanks, George. Congrats, Aisha. Saw a lot of party emojis on your new role. My name is Ricky Mananzala. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And last July, I started as the executive director of the New York Foundation, so it's still feeling pretty new. A lot of familiar faces on the screen, maybe current and former grantees. It was lovely to see. That's my story and how I came to the New York Foundation. So the work we support is community organizing and grassroots advocacy in New York City that's focused on racial, economic, gender, and climate justice work and building power in communities that have historically been shut out of power, resources, and opportunity. Those are my roots in grassroots organizing and leading the foundation. While it still feels new, is an honor. And in particular, this topic is important just as we think about our grant making and being more explicit about supporting BIPOC communities and building power. We should be looking at all levels of our organization to make sure that those values match not just our grant making, but things like consultants, procurement practices, our investment strategy, our investment advisors, all those things, which we'll talk more about in a moment. So it's really just bridging that gap between our grant making values and practice across all levels of the organization. That's why this topic is important. Thanks for the invitation, George.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. Diana, again, last but certainly not least, if you could, share a little bit of information, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I oversee the anti-racism and equity work at Good Shepherd Services. And Good Shepherd has been on the mission of being committed to racial and social justice since 2016, more deeply kind of invested in what that means for the agency. And we see this as part of that work, right? Like, what does it mean to help ensure that we are not only supporting our staff of color, but that we're ensuring that folks in our communities who are Black and Brown have access to resources, particularly when we are in a position to hire and contract with vendors. We're one of the larger nonprofits in New York City, right? So we see it as part of our responsibility to kind of contribute to this in a meaningful way. That's the shorthand answer.
Awesome. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, Aisha. And what's really interesting is that I think we saw the importance of this work play out in a really stark way during COVID, right? Where Black and Brown small businesses were disproportionately impacted by COVID. And then when PPP loan allocations were made, Black and Brown, small businesses had difficulty accessing those loans because maybe they didn't have the right banking relationships, or maybe they didn't have the right network, or maybe they couldn't make the call in order to sort of get their loan processed in a way that was going to give them sort of effective access to these loans. And so that was something I know for us, we said, okay, well, intuitively we know this is an issue, and we know on the corporate side they're working on sort of diversifying supply chain and procurement practices. But I don't want to say coming out of COVID, because we're still very much variants abound apparently. But where are we in this moment of COVID, the racial reckoning of 2020? Why is it important that we do this work through a racial and economic justice lens when prior it's been done through sort of a regulatory and compliance lens? So you touched on that a bit. So Diana, I think I'll stay with you and then go Ricky and Aisha. So why is it important to sort of do this work with that sort of shift, that shift and that reframing in mind?
Well, I think economic justice they're intersectional, right? You can't be doing racial justice without doing economic justice work, because we all know that this is about creating, giving communities the ability to thrive and not just survive, right? And in order to do that, you have to be thinking about how are they financially resourced and to be able to be self-sufficient and to thrive. So at its core, right, that's really what we're trying to focus on. And that's why it's important. It's how are we spending our dollars externally, and how are we also contributing even to, on the internal end, making sure that folks are getting paid living wages, right? So this is why it's a multi-pronged kind of approach. And we've been focused at Good Shepherd on both, right? Thinking about living wages for our staff, and then thinking about how we spend our dollars and funneling more of those dollars to Black and Brown vendors. And oftentimes what gets in the way of this work, when you look at it just from a compliance lens, which is what we've heard a lot, and you're just looking to check a box, you might leave out local Black and Brown vendors who aren't MWBE certified, right? Who can easily provide the resources you need, but don't know how to navigate that particular process. So that in and of itself can be a roadblock, an access point, which is also an equity issue, is how are we ensuring folks have access to resources they need. And the certification process is cumbersome, is what we've heard from vendors, even in our early roundtables in the coalition work. So by not being focused on compliance and making sure it's a racial and social justice issue, you capture folks who don't necessarily know how to navigate the MWBE certification process.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So, Ricky, you're the only sort of private foundation on our panel. So, when you think about sort of compliance issues and regulatory issues, we don't receive, money from government, and we don't receive money from donors. So, for you, sort of, how do you think about it? Is it a moral imperative, a racial and economic justice imperative? And, I guess, what would you say to folks who are like, just, focus on grant making and, the operational piece, and, the procurement piece is less important? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, thanks, George. Good question. I think, and I like how you framed the conversation too. Like, we're in this moment around the racial justice uprising. We're seeing the impacts of COVID, and there's a lot of stated commitments around DEI, or even in some cases racial justice, but maybe we're not seeing a lot of follow through. So I appreciate that framing. And some organizations choosing to engage in DEI work, it can look so many different ways. And this very specific concept of procurement practices, I'm really appreciating that you're putting it in that context. And I very much agree, like how we're thinking about who we hire, as Diana is saying, like I think you're saying budgets are a reflection of our values. It's not just how much we're putting into things, but actually who we're paying to do those things. Because ultimately this is about shifting. DEI is not just for the sake of feeling good. It's not just a moral imperative. This is ultimately about shifting access to power, resources, and opportunity. And so if every level of the organization, as Diana said, is aligned around that, so for us, it's not just our grant making, which already does focus on BIPOC communities and power building and grassroots organizing. But when I came in, we wanted to look at multiple levels of the organization. I think we'll have a question later where I can give some examples of that. But bringing alignment across the different areas, not just to our grant making, just makes us a stronger organization. I think taking a step back too and thinking about this DEI work and the framework we used even at the foundation when I started last year for some of these transformations was just the flawed nature of diversity, equity, and inclusion if we're not talking about the why. So with procurement practices, it's not just that we want to have diverse consultants or vendors. Yes, of course, but that should just be a fact. And a framing that I introduce or appreciate is that if equity and racial equity in particular is the goal or justice, inclusion is the process, and diversity is just a fact, right? If you've done those things already and set your real goals, looking for people of color, that's not the goal, right? And so diversity, meaning people of color being largely represented, and women in your procurement practices and in who your actual vendors and consultants are, is just a fact. And so that framing to me was really important, that we're not just going out and seeking diverse vendors or consultants. It's actually what are our broader organizational goals around racial justice and equity that then guide building that alignment across the organization.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. Aisha, I want to bring you in because you mentioned Black-led, POC-governed, POC principles at the core of the Laundromat Project's sort of value proposition and work. And so does this work just sort of naturally fit in, or is there sort of, I know with everything else the LP does, a certain level of intention around building an ecosystem of BIPOC vendors, consultants, and contractors that, sort of gravitate to the work that the LP does? I'd love for you to just talk a little bit more about, high level, like how does this begin to actually sort of show up and look in who you're partnering with?
Yeah, with lots of intention and lots of thought and lots of care, and lots of convening our broad network. It's always very frustrating. I won't say frustrating. It's always to hear that one of the challenges or hurdles that folks face often is that they don't know who to connect with which POC vendors to bring in. They don't have access to those networks of POC vendors. They are out there, and they are vast, and they are well networked and well networked. And it's all about how you're searching for those resources, or who you're connecting to or bringing in to ask those questions about. I need an HVAC vendor. Do you know a POC HVAC vendor? There are many, many, many out there. It's just a matter of the work that's happening on the ground to connect up to those resources. And so that's what we always do. We always start with, who do we know that might know this person, that might know this person, that can connect us to this vendor. It's not always a direct route. It really is, connecting with all of the convening power that we have access to, particularly here on this Zoom call, to make it to that intention of bringing in a more diverse pool of vendors. And so I would say our approach to it is always just mining our networks, constantly mining our networks, to figure out who we need to connect to, who knows and has access to the resource that we are looking to confirm. And so, yeah, a lot of intention is my very quick high level response. And it sounds simple, and it actually is simple when you understand just how vast our networks are and how connected we are to these resources.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Aisha. So I want to lift up a couple of things that sort of each one of you that resonated with me, that each one of you sort of lifted up. Is one, that intentionality, right? Is that it has to be intentional. There has to be sort of thought and care sort of put into this process in order to sort of mine those networks. And then the second thing are the networks, right? Is that, if you're asking yourself, where are these vendors, then maybe the next more fundamental question is that what networks are we in? And so, I think that's really, really interesting to think about, right? It's the intentionality, and then it's not them, it's you, right? It's like they're out there, they're vast, they're offering all of these services, they're highly skilled and talented. They're just waiting to be able to be plugged into opportunities. And so we need to think about how we shift our networks in a different way. So last year, the New York Equitable Economies Coalition, we did a series of roundtables with senior nonprofit leaders, CEOs, CFOs, COOs, operations managers, to sort of have a conversation about BIPOC procurement practices. And we heard some common themes that, they just are what they are, right? One, it's difficult to find BIPOC contractors, consultants, and vendors. If we find them, they can't deliver at scale, right? And so there's a scale issue, especially for larger nonprofits. They aren't professional enough, meaning that, whether that's they don't have the admin infrastructure to sort of provide sophisticated invoicing and accounting that our group needs in order to sort of file this away, or things of that nature, or they need to be MWBE certified. And so that was something that Diana spoke about and lifted up. Just for all of you, what do you say about these myths? I think, and maybe I shouldn't frame them as myths, but I think they are. So I'm just going to go ahead and go ahead and put it out there. Diana, I want to start with you. What do you say and you were in those roundtables, Diana. So what do you say to those folks who sort of lifted up those concerns, those questions, those anxieties, those thoughts?
Yeah, I think the one thing to highlight what Aisha said about network, I think all of us have our own pockets of networks, and there's no way that they're not connecting to each other. So I think one thing is, how do we create a system that brings all of the different individual networks together? And if we did that, we would be able to probably build a robust database of BIPOC vendors who we could access. Because right now it kind of functions to what Aisha said, and George and I are part of a group where we just post on a listserv like, hey, we need a vendor, a BIPOC vendor around this. And we'll get like random kind of submissions around that, but it's not necessarily centralized and managed in a way that feels coherent and easy to kind of access. So I think there is an access issue here, but not necessarily a network issue. It's about, how do I streamline these different networks? So that's kind of like one piece to it. Can they handle the invoicing? I think this is something that we just met at Good Shepherds yesterday, and to name like essentially the entire executive team, because that's how much of a priority this project is for us at GSS, where we were talking about how do we create multiple different entry points to pursue BIPOC vendors in different kind of ways. And so also thinking about, so challenging some of the myths means how do we think a little outside of the box around how we're pursuing procurement, so that we're not limited to thinking that a one-size solution is going to fit, especially because we are a big agency. The thing that we're really challenged by that we have talked about is where we get a lot of money from government contracts, right? So that can create a different kind of roadblock, particularly around, to your point, George, right? Like billing, invoicing, and also the amount of money that we get to be able to pay for OTPS expenses. So again, there are different approaches that we have to take because it's not a one size fits all for the different challenges. So I think that's some of the ways to bust the myths, is to think a little more broadly, think a little more outside the box, and develop solutions that work for through various entry points is what I mean, right? So we can create an RFP bidding process that's more accessible to BIPOC vendors, that's also values aligned. That's something that we also talked about a lot yesterday as a collective. What does it look like to do values alignment bidding, right, in our proposal process? So that's kind of one approach that we talked about. But then we also talked about a different approach for services, right? So, and larger contracts, because it is more affordable sometimes to buy things in bulk from Amazon. So we want to think about a different approach around some of that procurement. So again, that would be my shorthand answer to busting some of it, is focusing a little more on the problem and individualizing the solutions based on, because they're not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same answer for everything.
Awesome. Aisha, I want to bring you in because you're the next person on my box here. How are you sort of thinking about this with your staff, with your board, with your artist community, and just other sort of partners more broadly? So I know there's intentionality, but just sort of just share a little bit more about sort of, do these myths resonate with you? Do they make sense? Are you busting some of those myths just operationally? I'm asking because I sort of know firsthand that we are at the LP, but just want you to sort of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am curious, and I'll start with the myth about BIPOC vendors not being professional enough. And I am curious, professional by whose standards, and what does and who defines what professional is. And I would love, like, on a separate, to hear more about some of those reflections and go a little bit more in depth and nuance in those. We bust those myths every day. And just as we're sitting and talking right now, I'm thinking about, you know, just in real time, one of the, so I don't know how many folks, we are an arts and social justice organization, so we are connected to the arts community. One of the biggest art fairs in New York City is the Armory Show. And actually the general contractor for the Armory Show, the people who actually build the fair, is a Black-owned contracting business. It is a very large two-scale output or entity, and it is a Black person who's behind making that build out happen. So it's both around just the acknowledging and the visibility of that as a thing. And I think what we hold is the responsibility of actually making that visible, so that folks actually know that there are people behind that who can build to scale. It is a myth. It actually does happen in real time. If anybody has been to the Armory Show, you would see the scale of that build out. It is absolutely impressive. And so at the LP, to us, or the way that I think about it is that we have a responsibility of actually acknowledging and sharing out who some of these vendors are that are doing all the hard work behind the scenes, but not being acknowledged for it. And there's, I think there's an importance of making sure that folks know who is kind of circulating through this space and this field. So Yeah. Are we busting the myths? Absolutely. One of the things that we're doing is taking responsibility for sharing out who we're partnering with, who we have access to, who we know are doing the work, and making sure those connections happen. Definitely trying our best to follow up. If folks ask for a recommendation, we'll send you a list of different folks. If we don't know, we will send you to someone who actually does know. That's part of our work and part of the work that we do as an organization. It's not just a side thing. It's actually embedded in just how we function and operationalize what we do.
Awesome. Thanks, Aisha. Ricky, I want to bring you in, and I also want to, in your first year of leadership at the New York Foundation, you've done some incredible work around sort of fundamentally shifting some of those consulting, contracting, procurement relationships. So maybe broadly tell us about your thought process and the intentionality, how you partner with the board, staff, and others, and then maybe give us an example of, I know you've been chomping at the bit to do this, and I'm excited to hear from you as well. Just an example of sort of processes that the New York Foundation has gone to say, hey, we can have a different kind of relationship that's reflective of the communities that we serve. Let's go ahead and try to make that happen.
Thanks, George. I think, I had mentioned this earlier with our grant making. It kind of was obvious the communities we were often focusing on racial, economic, and gender justice organizing. We are largely funding organizations led by people of color, but we weren't being explicit about it in our criteria and priorities, like in our external facing materials. So I asked the staff and I started like, why is that? And so let's actually take a step back and think about all of our overall organizational goals around more deeply centering racial justice, or what we were calling intersectional racial equity work at that time. And so we went through a process of empowering staff and all of our trustees to look at, given your role, where can we better set goals and values around this intersectional racial equity work, including our grant making, but not stopping there, because I think that's where a lot of foundations stop, is in their grant making. So we looked at everything from procurement practices, as Diana said, compensation philosophy and benefits we offered our staff. Every board committee, from the investment committee to our governance committee to every single committee set its own goals at the trustee level around how they would center intersectional racial equity work, and everyone had a role to play and was empowered to play that role. Some examples, and George, I'm not just saying this because you are a leader behind this, but it's something as big as shifting who our investment consultant, or in this case advisor, is. We're a really, really old institution. We're over 109 years old. A lot of the relationships we've had as a foundation date back to times where it's like, hey, a friend of a friend, and the old boy network. This is why we have this current consultant across all the ranges of things, from IT to investments and everything in between. So we just had to start looking at that from both a governance perspective, but a values perspective. And that's why the board and staff, I think, got really invested to say, like, yeah, let's do an RFP for a new investment advisor, because we really wanted to look at where our assets were invested. Understandably, it's not just our grant making dollars going out the door, but what's the 95% of our endowment doing in the market right now? Is that aligned with our values? And we realized we needed an investment advisor that understood where we were trying to go. So we started an RFP process, and really excited to say we just selected a new investment advisor, that it's a Black-owned firm that really gets what we're trying to do. There's no question. And in that process of bringing the board and staff along, this is a very big decision for us, but no question. And so I think, like you said very earlier on, the intentionality behind this, not just being very siloed in our thinking of how to do this, I think that's where the work gets stalled. So I know if I'm thinking about something as specific as procurement practices, where we've got not just now a Black-owned investment advisor, but our event photographer was a Black trans person, right? Like everything in between, we should be thinking about this. This is not just the big decisions or just the grant making, but everything we're thinking about in all of the moves that we make. And I think this is a common refrain. I think many of you have embraced this. I think it was in a PNY, a Philanthropy New York webinar, but equity is not a thing you do, it's how you do all things. And so empowering everybody at all levels of the organization to see this as a part of their role and then their goal setting, I think has made, including trustees, has made this, I wouldn't say like a difficult process. In fact, it's just, I think everyone's feeling very motivated and empowered, and wants to, like you said, George, keep chomping at the bit on deeper changes we can make as a foundation.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. I think that investment management piece is key to lift up because there are some sectors and some services that are perceived to be sort of less diverse than others, and investment management is one of them, right? Where you might believe that there aren't any Black or brown folks doing investment management for institutional investors at a high level, but that's just wrong. And so how do we also sort of expand the opportunity set so that folks who are highly talented, who are Black and brown, can compete, right? So it's not about a lack of talent, it's a lack of opportunity. And so we know this to be true in many other things. And so this is just another case of, if we expand the opportunity set, if we reimagine our processes, policies, and procedures and make them more equitable, then the talent will flow sort of into all of those vending, contracting, and consulting verticals that we're looking for partnership in. Aisha, I'd love for you to talk about, the laundromat project, about, 8 months ago, or maybe even a year ago. I can't believe time flies. Moved into a new space. And so that was a very sort of tangible opportunity for the LP to be thoughtful about, who we partnered with on the engineering side, on the contracting side, and things of that nature. So would love for you to just talk about sort of that process and lift up some of the folks maybe potentially that we worked with.
Yeah, thank you, George. It was 8 months ago that we finished it. We signed the lease on the space in March of 2020. And actually we found the space, our real estate person was a Black person, a person of color, intentionality around that. And built out the space, working with a local contractor. It's a collective, a small collective, collaborative that's in the neighborhood. A lot of the work that we do at the LP is very much centered around reinvesting resources within the community directly. And so as we approached the build out itself and everything that's associated with the build out, we had that at top of mind, again, going back to intentionality. So working with a local collective as a contractor, it was actually their first build out. So taking a chance on people also is something that I want to encourage folks to do too. Sometimes it's just hard to break into the space, and to give someone a chance to actually show what they have the ability to do is very, very important. And so this was their first major build out. Encourage everyone to come and visit us at 1476 Fulton Street in Bed-Stuy. It is absolutely beautiful, a beautiful space. And they've actually received contracting jobs from our build out specifically, which is really great. But like George said, intentionality, again, around everything. The folks who help with our trash collection, it's actually an immigrant, local small business owner, Black man from Barbados. And again, intentionality around that. The folks who manage our security system in the storefront is Colombian. The folks who are space beautification people, not our cleaning people, but our space beautification people, is a collective of women from Honduras. So all of that took just connecting, sending out, understanding the value and how vast our network is and how powerful our network is. And it's just sending one simple note: do you all know a POC cleaning service? And of no surprise that there was a long list of folks that came back to us. But again, in everything that we do, always with that intention of knowing that diversity is important to us, bringing opportunity or giving opportunity to folks who are often overlooked because of a system is very important to us, which has led us to have a very, very extremely diverse procurement process that we value, do very high quality work. And very happy to share resources and contacts with folks if you're interested.
Yeah, no, thanks, Aisha. Just Diana, before I bring you in, I just want to lift up that sort of these are real dollars that are impacting, individuals, families, communities. So when I think about sort of like bridging the racial wealth gap, and like these are consequential dollars in a positive way, right? Sort of, Aisha, to your point, that, engineering and architectural collaborative, LP takes a chance on them, and then that generates and begets more business for them. And so, so organizations can play a small but meaningful role in like getting the businesses going, right? And so it's always difficult to get that first contract or those first couple of contracts. And so, I just want to sort of lift that up, Aisha, is that, these are real dollars that are flowing out into communities that are helping individuals, families, and communities, and, hopefully beginning to sort of, help folks bridge those, those wealth gaps, sort of, Ricky, when I think about the investment advisor, that's huge in terms of myth busting, right? It's like, there might have been folks who told us you'll never find sort of everything that you're looking for in an advisor, sort of, a Black owned, POC staff, great returns, and can also help you with the values alignment piece. And we said, well, we think that's possible, and so there's a trust there in the sector. Diana, I wanna bring you in because I think it's important to lift up that the Laundromat Project is a small but mighty community-based organization. The New York Foundation is a private foundation, and Good Shepherd Services is a huge enterprise. And so for you, Diana, what are some of the sort of at GSS, what are some of the procurement, considerations, and what are some of the similarities, but also some of the differences? Because you all are thinking about scale, you all are thinking about decentralized sites and things of that nature, where Ricky and Aisha might not be thinking about that in the seats that they sit. So just want to hear from you. Tell us sort of what are some of the similarities and differences at a larger shop.
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned one, right? We're funded 85% of our dollars come from government contracts, right? So it's a different kind of management system, a different kind of reporting system where you have to report on the usage of MWBEs, which means, again, it's just a different lift in that regard. So that's one thing. We're also $100 million operating budget agency, right? So to your point, while it's a little harder, right? Just you're talking about more scale around kind of what you're managing. We also have 90 programs across different boroughs. So there are elements of our procurement process right now that are centralized, right? And then there are elements that are happening in program locally on the ground. So there are bits that are decentralized and bits that are centralized. And then we also haven't necessarily found a way to track if we're not going to go the MWBE certification route, right, then how are we tracking racial demographics of any vendor that we work with, right? So it's building out a mechanism or a system that can capture some baseline data for us. That's kind of one thing that we've been talking about working on. The other thing, which is why I said we're developing a multi-pronged approach to problem solving around it. Then it's the RFP bidding process for any consultant. So like if we are coming up with a bid for, I'll throw one out there, let's just say we're looking for a consultant around strategic planning. I'm not saying we are, but we are about to go through a strategic planning process. So that's what made me think of it. We could prioritize, right? Like, how are we recruiting for that? What kinds of questions are we asking in the proposal submission process that are related to racial justice, right? Because again, we're trying to make sure values alignment and that we're attracting a diverse set of vendors as well. So those are some of the bigger challenges that we're dealing with. And we've also heard this from some of our sister agencies who are also as big, the trouble with centralizing information and having it be decentralized and centralized at the same time, the restrictions around government contracts and spending, right? Another example that came up in our meeting yesterday is with small businesses, sometimes you can't do a return on the goods that you have to purchase, right? And so for us, being a larger nonprofit, sometimes if we have to make returns, and do we have the room and the bandwidth to do that? So again, there are lots of other kind of micro issues that emerge when you're thinking about scale. And there's also how much can we spend if we have government contracts and there's only a certain amount that they're willing to allocate and spend on certain expenses. So again, lots of kind of considerations for us. But I do think one of the pieces to underscore what Aisha said, I still think one piece for all of us, even in the larger nonprofit context, is we don't have one centralized kind of database of vendors that we could even begin to have some conversations with around some of this work. So I think that's going to be a big piece of support for all nonprofits, small or big. I hope that answers the complexity of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to lift up that same point that was made in the chat by my dear friend and colleague Keith Timko, is that, where is that central repository? Where is that place? Because I don't know about y'all, I got a spreadsheet. I know, Diana, I know you got a spreadsheet. Ricky got a spreadsheet. Aisha got a spreadsheet. Folks have spreadsheets where it's like, okay, how do we sort of keep track of, all of our friends who are doing this work in different verticals? And I've sent out mine, and I've, updated mine, getting other, other things. And so, yeah, maybe to that point, maybe it's a low tech solution, right? It's like this Google sheet. Maybe, maybe that's where we sort of start, right? And say, hey, here's one place where you can just populate populate this spreadsheet. We all can see it. It's open source, and you can sort by vendor type and geography and what they do, and and maybe that's a start where we don't have to overthink it. I don't know. I'm just sort of I'm brainstorming here, but we'll see. Yeah.
I just want to name that the MW, there is a list that exists, right? Because when we started the coalition, we pulled up the MWBE list. And then we particularly pulled up minority-owned business lists, right? Because we wanted to make sure that we were attracting POC-owned businesses, right? And the list is massive, and it's not easy to navigate. It was like really long, a little confusing, and it didn't feel accessible, right? And friendly for someone who's like, I need this vendor around to what you're saying around this. And not have it be, you know what I mean? Like, I don't even know how to navigate it. So I think that's the other issue, is that there is some advocacy that we could also do to the city about how to make the information that they have been collecting and even working with MBE certified businesses, right? To make it better, easier to access and digest as a nonprofit, because it's not right now.
Yeah, Diana, I just want to stay with you really quickly because I want to be cognizant of time. We're talking about the MWBE sort of certification process, and I know, for smaller nonprofits that aren't necessarily getting government contracts, that's not in their purview. They've got more discretion about who, sort of they can connect with and work with. But for larger nonprofits that are, where 80% of the budget is government contracts, sort of how are you thinking about that MWBE certification at Good Shepherd Services? Because there is you do have to think about that.
We do, and I think sometimes, right, we're not successful at meeting some of those, right? Because again, it's hard. It's not an easy process. But I do think we are Good Shepherd are just committed to doing what's right and to increasing BIPOC procurement in general. So what we've decided, again, internally, is how can we just create systems that will attract more BIPOC vendors, whether they are MWBE certified or not. But the other thing that we have been talking about, again, and we just had a conversation yesterday, is can we do some advocacy on the city level to express some of our collective concerns through this coalition, to be able to say, here are some things we think you could improve upon so that BIPOC vendors would have a better time kind of navigating your system and then getting access to us. Because I think the real piece here, it's not necessarily just it's the access to opportunities. There's plenty of opportunity, but we're not creating systems that are accessible.
Got you. Yeah, no, that's, yeah. So no, thanks so much for that, Diana. Ricky, I'm gonna kind of sort of put you on the spot, because some of the ideas that are bubbling up will take resources to realize, right? And so, as a philanthropic leader, what would you say to your peers in the philanthropy space? Is there a role to play in philanthropy? Would you encourage foundations to think about their procurement practices internally, like the New York Foundation is? And then, do you think sort of there's room to support this work in the ecosystem?
And George, I feel like you just laid out my points, so I'll just repeat what you said. No, I'm just kidding. I think a couple things. There's things that we're actually already doing as a foundation. I think even Junie's point, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, like the creation of a centralized database with good technology and hiring a person of color or other vendor to do that work. Great. That's something that we did for our grantees, and identifying or developing a database of consultants that are primarily people of color, in the areas of all the capacity building needs around communications, organizational development, strategic planning, et cetera. So we helped the creation of that, and that's something that that grantees use and are helping to build out and really vet these consultants that are helpful for their work. So more funders kind of stepping into that space, asking for responding to the needs of groups around things like that. I could see supporting this coalition's need for a database that's centralized with the fancy technology that goes beyond the hashtag one spreadsheet. I think is a good place to start. But I think there's philanthropic advocacy that you're getting to also, George. Like, this is such a specific thing, but it's like has such a ripple effect, as Diana and you and others have said, that looking at our own practices, we're a small foundation, in terms of not like Good Shepherd Services where you have a ton of vendors. Like, we have very few, and the amount we're spending is limited, but some of our peers are quite large. And looking at their procurement practices within the context of their broader organizational equity and racial equity goals in particular, I think is a role that we could play. And I think just looking again, like back at, the question of why. And so why does this matter in the context of an organization's broader values and goals? I think is really important to stay grounded in that work. But I think our grantees are asking for this, right? Like, most common questions our program officers get is, we need someone who gets who we are, that is aligned with our values. And we have some ideas on some networks, but can you create this for us? Can you help? Can you give us recommendations? And so going back to my first point, which is listen, create the networks, bring the networks together, as Diana and Aisha have said, and then make that known at a scale that I think we can do as a foundation for the many, many organizations we support.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Ricky. And I also think there's a sort of role for philanthropy to play in sort of supporting BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants,
Yep.
and sort of building their capacity to go after and receive those opportunities, right? Because Diana said, the opportunities are there, but the access isn't. And so for nonprofits, we can sort of expand the opportunity set, but then will those vendors be ready to take on additional opportunities? So
that's exactly it.
There's a potential role for philanthropy to play to say, okay, how do we build the capacity of both sides, right? Nonprofits as more intentional, inclusive purchasers of services, and then BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants sort of increase their readiness to take advantage of more opportunities that the nonprofits will provide. So if we're all doing our work well, everybody's got the capacity to sort of lean in. So so there's an opportunity there too. And I will sort of Philanthropy New York just recently put out their strategic plan that has a very keen focus on DEI and racial justice practices. And so this work is right in line. So for all of you philanthropies out there, this work is, if you want something tangible to do towards those strategic goals that PNY laid out a few weeks ago, this is a scope of work that's right in line. So just little plug there for our funders in the space. Okay, we discussed a lot of challenges, issues, solutions. I want to move us into a dream space really quickly. What does it look like if this problem is solved? As some of you know, Wakanda Forever just came out, and so I'm a huge fan. What does a Wakanda Forever procurement ecosystem in New York City and in the state look like? What does it feel like? How are we engaged? How's the city engaged? How's the state engaged? How are funders engaged? How are BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants engaged? Aisha, I'm going to bring you in, then ask Ricky to share, and then Diana to close us out.
That's a very big question. All the people. What does it look like? A Wakanda Forever moment around this, getting to a space where we aren't having this conversation anymore, where we all know exactly where to find those POC vendors. We are all activating them, and they are all a part of our just general organizational ecosystem. To me, feels like a Wakanda space to be in. Folks know where to go, who to ask, what to do, how to activate, all the things, no question. It just is. So that's my quick Wakanda space.
Awesome. Thanks, Aisha. Ricky, what about you? What do you think?
That's it. I think that's it. And I think the work is just better for that reason. Like that there's less tension, all the myths have dissipated. And that this is still ultimately about power and opportunity. And so that we've reached that place. And for that reason, the work feels easeful. It's just better with leadership from Black and Brown folks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. Diana, what do you think?
Yeah, I would like to benchmark it too, right? So meaning that at least 50% potentially of all of our vendors are BIPOC major contracts, not just like small contracts, but 50% of all contracts are like given to BIPOC vendors, right? So that's kind of to me is like, how do we benchmark this and hold ourselves accountable to the benchmark as a collective industry? Because then it's easy to be like, yeah, we're going to change our practices and never benchmark it. So there's never like any real accountability around this for us to have to do it beyond the moral imperatives. I really like what Ricky said, that it's now a goal, right? And like everyone has a racial equity goal. So to me, that would be a big deal if we saw more dollars kind of, and we could name a tangible number of dollars that are going to BIPOC vendors on a local level, and maybe, you know, even national, right? Because some vendors don't have to be in New York City for you to be accessing them. But to me, that would be a big deal. And for folks to say, I didn't have to worry about the access issue because I got 5, 10 referrals to pick from that are BIPOC. And right. So to me, that's another issue that if in an ideal world, that issue is also resolved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I know we're supposed to go to 12:15, so I want to just lift up a few sort of key takeaways or things that really resonated with me. Then gratitude to the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. One, Ricky, something that you said that sounds like sort of a really sort of like intentional next step in terms of like, and it's also like it's not low hanging fruit, but it's put this work back on your board committee in partnership with staff. Like that is something that can be done tomorrow, right? Is that sort of if you've got a racial equity goal or a DEI goal, go to your respective board committees and say, how are you going to operationalize this, right? How's your finance committee going to operationalize this? How's your governance committee going to operationalize this? How's your program committee going to operationalize this? And then partner with staff and other networks and stakeholders to really come up with plans, you know, that can be executed on. So I just want to lift that up as a key takeaway is that, you know, this isn't just on the CEO or the CFO or the COO. You can involve your entire organization, including your board on this, and really potentially activate, you know, everyone's power around this. So that's one. Two, it's information sharing, right? Don't just ask, you know, the person to the left of you or the right of you, do they know someone? Really be intentional about sort of reaching out to diverse networks and sourcing BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants. And so that's work that's got to be done with intentionality. Use all of us, right? Everyone's got spreadsheets, so don't dispel the myth that, you know, these vendors, contractors, or consultants aren't out there. They are, you know, and people are doing really good work with that. So just diversify your network. Maybe ask an additional 5 people if they have a recommendation, as opposed to sort of asking one person and then being like, oh, well, I tried, you know. So that's another sort of key takeaway there. Something else that I would uplift that isn't lost with me is that hire people with those networks, right, into the C-suite, right? So it isn't lost on me that Black and Brown led nonprofits or or nonprofits that have Black and Brown folks in C-suite roles also then get access to the commensurate networks, and they get access to the commensurate talent and skills and ecosystem. So if you've got a CFO opening, you know, maybe you get a twofer, right? You get a really, really smart CFO, and then you also get access to their network, right? So, you know, there's an opportunity there as well. And then there's an advocacy effort, right? I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. It's just how can we sort of all support each other and work smarter around it? Because there's talent out there, and there are spreadsheets out there, and there are databases out there, but how do we sort of consolidate, amplify, and augment some of the work that's already being done around this? And then just create something that's accessible for all of us to use. So those are sort of the 3 things that I just want to lift up as potentially key takeaways. Now, gratitude. Ricky, Aisha, Diana, thank you for spending time with us, for sharing stories, giving us tangible examples. and just for your leadership. I just appreciate the three of you so much. So just wanted to um, say thank you to each of you. Thank you. Now questions. This is meant to be sort of a round table. I want to hear from folks out in the Zoom room. What are your thoughts? What are your concerns? What are your questions? What are your anecdotes? How are you all thinking about this? Et cetera, et cetera. So. I'm scanning for hands for.
I think someone's mic went on, but I'm not sure if they meant to. So
that was me. So I'm joining in by audio. My name is Erin Trottier. Could I ask a couple questions?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So I'm the operations and business manager at 2164. And my colleague Jumi Falusi-Seaman extended the invitation to this roundtable today. So 2164 is a nonprofit practice that provides multi-generational advising and facilitation and training for next-gen engagement. And we literally just started to review all of our vendors. And, we have a list of like 55 plus, ranging anywhere from like graphic designers to like our technology to things like Dropbox or like insurance and 401k. So, everything that you all spoke about today is exactly where we're headed. But we're wondering, how do we determine if it's officially BIPOC letter owned? Like, should we look for those certificates? We're tagging website pages for like, details on their ownership and leadership and like their statements, but how do we take it to that next step? And then if we're ruling, vendors out, should we come to you all for like next steps on these great lists that we're compiling? Like, where should someone really begin, as we literally just started reviewing? Like, what are your suggestions?
Diana, you want to jump in there? I know you do a lot of thought with GSS around this, so I don't know if you wanted to.
yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing is, I think you're in a great place, Erin, meaning that you are in an information gathering space with a very open mind and thinking about your commitment to race equity as you kind of go through it. So that's already a super helpful kind of space to be in. One of the things that we did yesterday internally was we just mapped out like, what are all the things we are doing, right? Like, what are all the things we are doing? What do we know about the data? What does the data say, right? And again, for us, we don't even collect demographic data. So that was like one thing, like, how can we figure out how do we get access to that data? So I think it's just mapping out all of the things that are happening and where are there potential kind of gaps in process that we can then problem solve for. So I think being intentional even about these conversations will allow you to create a targeted strategy that's going to work for your organization, right? Because again, for Good Shepherd, we're developing a multi-pronged approach based on our particular kind of needs. So the other thing is, if you're needing, can I talk a little bit about the coalition then, George? Because I'm like,
yeah, no, go for it.
Pivot. So we have been leading this coalition space, George and I, right? Good Shepherds and George. It's a great space to also come and be with folks to kind of think through some of the challenges you're talking about, because we are also getting ready to design a vendor survey. We actually already have started designing it. We're getting ready to enhance it and to send that out to all of our networks to capture BIPOC vendors who may or may not be MWBE certified, to get to your point. But we do have a series of questions that we are collectively designing as a coalition to gather some of the information that you're talking about, information that we think would feel good and allow us to move forward. I think the other piece, though, goes back to what Aisha and I have been saying about network. So when we release that survey, our goal is to create a ad hoc kind of like Google spreadsheet. If it's that, I don't know what it's going to look like, but some intermediary ad hoc kind of lists. Marketplace is what we've been calling it, where nonprofits can refer other vendors that they have worked with and are think
Right.
would meet the need. So I think some of this is just being in community with other folks who are doing it and thinking with them about it, and then identifying your own particular needs and issues. I hope that helped. So we hope folks sign on to the coalition. Like, that's a big deal
Right.
for us. We've been meeting regularly for at least a year, and the genius comes from the collective. It never comes from one voice. And so rely on us. If you need to join us, I can drop the link in the chat as well, and I will do that. But I hope that was helpful.
Great.
And
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing is, more broadly, it's just, understand that this process is going to be incremental. Like, that's the thoughtfulness piece, is that you're not going to just turn over all of your vendors overnight. That's absurd. That doesn't make any sense. But start, to Diana's point, start somewhere. Start having the conversation with your board committee. Start having the conversations with your staff. Start intentionally and incrementally building your network of BIPOC providers, and then where there are natural opportunities to shift, then, sort of use a process to test drive. Like, oh, we're having an event in 3 months. Maybe this event is the event that we use to be more intentional about sourcing BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants. Oh, there's a natural sort of turnover in our audit, in our auditor. Let's use this opportunity to rethink our RFP process for a new auditor. So there are natural inflection points where sort of this work can be done thoughtfully and incrementally. So I just wanted to lift that up, is that the expectation isn't that tomorrow everyone's turned over all of their vendors, contractors, and consultants, but you do have to start somewhere. And part of it is having these intentional conversations about what the next steps are. Really quickly, we had another question in the chat that I want to lift up. What can BIPOC providers do to increase visibility for these procurement opportunities? And sort of, I know that's something, Diana, that we've been working with, working with the coalition with, but I don't know sort of in the short term, sort of what the answer is to that question is. Maybe it is #1 spreadsheet, as a minimally viable sort of solution until we build out something more robust. What do folks think about that?
That's a hard, I don't have a direct or a fully comprehensive answer to that one. But maybe it's even thinking, on a small scale, as you're working with, one of the things that we do as we're working with a vendor, we will always say, if you're open to new clients, are you okay with us referring you or sharing your name? We get emails constantly about folks who are looking for communications consultants, fundraising consultants, who are looking for contractors, and all the things that I brought up earlier today. And it's, I think it's both it's a dual kind of ask of us kind of being proactive and asking the vendor themselves, would you be okay with us sharing as we get asked for these types of resources? That's one of the small things that I could offer, is just like proactively encouraging them to be drawn into these networks of folks who are looking.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea, Aisha. Maybe it is a matter of sort of like the nonprofits proactively sort of reaching out to this network of coalition members and friends of the coalition and saying like, hey, you all said I had to diversify my network. Here I am asking and, sourcing, BIPOC, providers, in a certain vertical. Send me information, send me referrals. And so, maybe that's the start of it. Maybe that's the answer to sort of how nonprofits can sort of, release those opportunities and then connect with, referrals, a referral network that's diverse. So something to.
I just want to also take the opportunity to elevate the internal assessment, which is the second link I dropped in the chat. So one of the things that we know is really helpful, again, to generate like a collective narrative, is assessing and our organizations. And so we have anecdotally, we assume we know what we're going to get from the data based on the size of the nonprofit and the type of organization. But we do want to be able to tell the story of procurement practices, challenges, and best practices in general, right? And we do need some data to be able to do that. So the internal assessment is a link to a SurveyMonkey, a survey where we're asking folks to share what are their procurement practices? What are their challenges, right? And then what we want to do as a coalition, a collective coalition, is produce a report around what we discover from the internal assessment. And it is New York City, New York State based, right? Again, because we want to take that to inform our advocacy and then take that to inform a best practices toolkit that we then can share with the entire sector and hopefully have a bigger impact. Sorry, I had to plug it.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so yeah, I would just say, yeah, please join please join the coalition. We know everybody's really, really busy, and so, but we need the sort of the thought partnership. Again, this is mostly a volunteer effort, sort of folks just trying to hold the coalition together. Special shout out to Diana and her team at Good Shepherd Services for really sort of helping us to hold the space in a way that's organized and where we can sort of do things like this and send out information and sort of keep folks plugged in and gather all of your ideas. But this isn't a sort of well-resourced effort like anything else. This is grassroots. That's why we're a coalition. It's just folks being like, I think this is important. Here's how I can help. So, the more people that are involved in the brain trust, the better. I just want to lift up something that somebody shared in the chat around including a markup in the budget, so a racism subsidy. I think that's a real sort of conversation to have, but I also think that the first step of that will be price point transparency, because something that we know is that a lot of BIPOC vendors, contractors, and consultants will underbid. And so I think this is the first step in us getting to a point where it's like, oh, well, no, actually, like, you should be charging $25,000 more for your services because, your peers and counterparts that are white are charging that, and they're actually getting the contract. So don't underbid, bid at market rate. And then, then the next conversation is definitely around a markup. But I think this will be part of sort of the good work that we'll be able to sort of mine from this. It's 12:14. I want to be cognizant of time. Again, gratitude to each and every one of you for spending this time with us. We hope it was helpful. I promised you that we wouldn't have all of the answers, but I definitely think we provided some answers, some approaches, some solutions, and would invite each and every one of you to join us in this work, because again, we're just trying to get to a better place around this, and we think that everybody has a role to play. So sign up for the coalition, come to the meetings, send us ideas offhand or separately, and we'll incorporate those. We just think this work is really important, and because you're here, we believe you think it's important too. So with that, gratitude to each and every one of you. Ricky, Aisha, Diana, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. We'll put together some takeaways and maybe send it out to folks who have participated, so you can bring that to your folks in your respective organizations. So thank you all. Have a great day.